The metallic hum of a hidden king met the wind above ancient stone. Jungle drums still answered one another far behind him, but there the sound thinned and became only a memory in the cloak that lay about his shoulders, wet with rain, smelling green and iron, threaded with the faint, bright pulse beneath his palm that was not song, but substance. He moved from leaf to marble, as if from dream to memory, and the white stone courts of Gondor opened like a stern eye to receive him. Underfoot, the steps remembered other feet, and over them the sky kept the chill of high places. T'Challa did not hurry. He carried his country in the weight of his silence. He came with no army on the road, nor with banners that might call men to war. What he bore was smaller, a compact folded in cloth of dark weave, a palm-sized device of metal that tasted of thunder and bee-light, and the quiet manner of one who had walked long with strangers. The carved table of kings waited in the hall, its rim worn by the elbows of 100 counselors. He set the compact down, and the stone seemed to answer with the long hush of things that had been forged for longer than any man's measure. Around him, those who sat rose and did not bow easily. They inclined by degrees, like branches under a bird's weight, each keeping his judgment in reserve. Skepticism rode them as surely as a cloak. There were gentlemen of cloak and token, faces mapped by winters and the care of office. A steward in sable asked his name with a voice that kept its temper. T'Challa answered by place and by purpose. Wakanda, a kingdom that has known the shape of predators and the solace of craft. He spoke of a peril that could be met, not with more men alone, but with a change in how they met metal and flame. He did not promise miracles. He offered a choice: to bind their fates by oath and aid, or to let the southern walls remain as they were, trusting to walls and time. Whispers crossed the hall like birds. Some saw hope as a road to power, some saw it as a highway to hidden price. When courtesies had circled and landed, T'Challa unfastened the cloth with a motion like prayer. In his hands the device was small, no larger than a palm, hammered into impossible conceits. Metal that did not throw light but kept it alive, seams that swallowed shadow. The Wakandan envoy beside him, a woman with eyes like cooled steel and a voice old with respect, spoke little. She set the object upon the table and raised her hand. For all its craft, the thing made no sound when it awoke. It breathed a pale blue that was not flame and not water, a light that seemed to answer something older than the hall. A youth of Gondor stepped forward, eager and fierce in a way that is both a young man's failing and a young man's virtue. The envoy bade him lay a blade upon the light. He obeyed, fingers trembling. The tip of the sword, dull with use and nicked by stones, touched the metal and was made of new edge in a heartbeat. He felt heat, not violent, but precise, a warmth like a smith's hand guiding a temper. The blade sang as if it had learned a new note. Murmurs rose, wonder, suspicion, the thin spice of envy. Men who had trusted only the old ways felt their confidence loosen like a bootlace pulled by wind. The steward asked demonstrably how such a thing could be. The envoy smiled in a way that was almost private. She said a word T'Challa had taught her for witness, vibranium, and then described, in the spare language of smiths, how the metal drank force and remembered it, how smallness could hold a storm. They brought forth a shard of broken mail, old and scorched. The Wakandans set the device near, and the mail knit itself under the blue light, seams closing, not like men sewing, but like a river finding its old bed. Men reached to touch the repaired metal and could not tell whether it had been healed by sorcery or by craft so fine it blooms like a living thing. Doubt kept its face as it listened. One elder rose and spoke for the stone. "You bring wonders," he said, "but wonders ask for coin, or for sons, or for steadier oaths than this hall's comforts allow." It was not only lip the elder moved, there was an ache of memory in his voice. Old bargains gone sour, friendships undone by secret clauses. Chala answered not by argument, but by a chest moved with steady breath. He told of Wakanda's fear of the same shadow that long preyed on other realms. He did not name Sauron, he spoke instead of the great shadow that gathers and takes the small lights first. He spoke like one who had watched his own people tremble beneath the claws of hunger and had vowed to teach them to stand. There was a silence, like the one that falls between bells when a steeple is being struck. Men of Gondor looked to the high windows, at the ringed hills, and at the river running out toward the sea. Hope tilled the soil of their faces. Fear rooted itself there too. The steward, who held the seal of many winters, asked what payment Wakanda would ask. T'Challa did not say gold. He said simply that he would ask for places to learn and for promise to stand, and that Wakanda would alter no law without consent, take no land without counsel. He offered instead to bind his people's smiths and knowledge to Gondor, to teach to the men of the White City how to temper their swords by a new law of metal. This was not a demand, but a proposal of mutual making. When the compact was unfastened again, the cloth set aside, the envoy brought forth a smaller wonder, a globe no larger than an apple, etched with runes that caught the light. It humbly showed a map of the world as men in that hall knew it, and then it showed what else lay beyond, a smear of darkness in the east, movement like ants under stone. She turned it delicately, and where the dark moved, a thin thread of shimmering light traced routes for scouts, for riders, for those who would strike before the shadow set. Men leaned. Old soldiers began to count quietly on their fingers. A captain, scarred and mute with years of campaign, asked whether such light could be carried into the field. The woman placed it into his hands. It did not burn him. It warmed like a thought. As they debated, the great doors of the hall thudded and then opened again to admit rain and a rider who came like a blown note. He was dusted with the map's east, sorrel and parched to the color of old bone, and his horse bore gallop marks that told of no short road. He fell from his mount before the steward, clutching a long horn and a scroll stained with the grit of the eastern plains. The rider's breath made quick gusts, and his eyes held the wildness of one who had seen more than he wished to tell. He spoke in a voice cut to its edge by haste. Scouts from the wastes bring word of a gathering, shapes that ride at night with banners of smoke, of villages left black, of a wind that smells of iron and old grief. A low riot of voices rose. Men looked from the rider to the Wakandan and back again. The steward's face went tight, as if a hand had closed upon it. T'Challa stepped forward, and for a second the hum beneath his palm answered the rider's hurried words, as if the metal recognized trouble. He listened, paying attention to the shape of the tail rather than to its embroidery. The rider spoke of a thing that did not march like an army, but moved like a sickness. Slow at first, then spreading. Black banners riding the ridgelines, wolves following where the banners fell. The council weighed each word like coin. Some called the riders brigands. Others named what they feared with a mouth that tried to steady on the old names but found them too small for the new fear. The evening thickened. Torches were lit and set into their scones, their light brittle with apprehension. Men who had argued about law now spoke of roads and rations, of scouts to set between Gondor and the eastern waste. Some proposed parley. Some spoke of fortifying the outlying towers. T'Challa felt the urgency as a taut chord in the air. He offered what Wakanda could give at once: small teams to teach repair and defense, devices to shield a bridge for a night, men trained to move like thought. He did not promise miracles. He promised presence. The steward leaned his forehead upon his hand and weighed the truth in such offers as if he weighed winter grain. One counselor, whose beard was braided with silver and whose voice carried the rough song of frontier speech, said plainly that Gondor could not be both open and unguarded. "If your metal holds," he said, "then we must see it in the field." The writer's tale made the proposal no longer a thing of politics, but a matter of survival. To test or to wait, this was the hinge. Eyes turned to the Wakandan envoy to see whether this strange people would yet be content with the hall's favors, or whether they would follow promise with peril. T'Challa's gaze traveled the map upon the table, the knife edges of mountains, the ribbon of the river, and then rested upon the east, where the writer's ink had stained the scroll. He set his palm upon the table right where a road led toward the place the writer had named. The metallic hum beneath his skin answered like a heart called to march. He lifted his hand, and in that lifting there was the motion of intent that looked not like threat, but like vow. "Then let our first lesson be given where it will matter," he said, his voice both the hush of a grave and the steady warmth of hearthlight. "Send scouts with my men. Let them show your captains what we can do. If the shadow is as the writer says, we will stand or fall by our choosing." The steward closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, the decision had not been made, but the council had bent toward motion. The night outside pressed at the windows like a living thing inside. Alliances uncoiled, and a map was laid for hands to move. The air beneath the ancient canopy had the hush of galleries done with peat and time. It held the memory of many voices and would not be hurried. Elrond moved among his people as one who walks a riverbed he has known since childhood. His sight was like a blade of clear water that passed through surfaces and saw what lay beneath. Near the stonework, where the elves kept their oldest wards, men of a different craft had laid out metal that did not belong to Middle-earth. The metal drank the moonlight as if it were thirsty, and when the Wakandan engineers opened their cases, it was as though a small and secret lightning had been caged and then set on a cloth. The prince stood beside them, his posture calm and unafraid. The princess, smaller and bright-eyed, began to speak low instructions in a tongue of numbers and pattern. An elf reached out, not with a gauntleted hand, but with the old deliberate courtesy of those who know that even curiosity can wound. Elrond placed his fingertips against the edge of the shimmering ore. At once a sound came, not audible in the first sense, but present like a remembered bell, felt in bone and in the hollow of the throat. The Wakandan engineers listened as if to a chord that answered them. One struck a padded mallet, and the ore returned a note like a place between thunder and the singing of strings. The note hung in the pine-scented air and made the ward stones at Elrond's feet tremble with a small answering light. Elrond closed his eyes and let the elf sight open. He saw weavings, thin and filmy, running like veins through the ore. He saw the old runes laid in the stone above them respond, not as obedient servitors, but as companions testing a new step. The metal took the elf song into itself and changed it, adding a depth like echo gathered from a cave. The runes threw a thread back, speaking in a cadence that belonged to river and reed, and the engineers, whose work had hitherto been with circuits and frequencies, widened their hands, delighted and astonished. The meeting was not clumsy. It moved with the inevitability of a tide and the curiosity of children toward a conversation neither people had expected. One of the engineers set a slender device against the oar. The princess named the adjustment softly. Her voice threaded numbers and conjectures and, in the language of the elves, images of living wood. She placed a hand near a rune and spoke, not to coax, but to offer. What followed was less a clashing than a folding. Light bled from the runes as if from frost, and the metal took it and replied with ripples of blue-violet that crawled across its breast like the underglow of a lake after a storm. The elves who watched straightened, for though they had seen many strange things through ages, this was new, an alloy of cunning and enchantment that made both seem younger than they had been. The experiment became a demonstration, and demonstrations are small rehearsals for larger acts. Elrond asked the prince to allow the forging of a small thing. He asked nothing of warcraft. He spoke of protection more than of power. The princess, with hand steady as any elder smith, guided Wakandan thread through a lattice designed by elven fingers. The lattice did not sit upon the metal. It breathed with it, each strand answering the metal's hum with a faint warmth like a hand beneath the cloak. Where the thread lay, the air itself seemed to thicken, and the scent of iron became honeyed, as if the very alloy remembered bone and leaf and had decided to become less forbidding. A shield was the first to be made. It was not a shield of stamped iron or hammered steel. It was woven of light and sound and the strange, slow solidity of vibranium. When the princess placed it upon a bench, it sighed with a small living motion and then lay still. Elrond set a glove to the rim and felt something like a memory reach out. Images of past sieges and the hush that falls over a battlefield before the final charge. He felt, too, an answering comfort, as if the shield remembered not only what it had been told to guard against, but what it was meant to keep. Songs, children, the names of trees. The prince nodded once, and the engineers around him allowed themselves a rare and brief smile. They went further. An elf maiden sang a small old stave under her breath, while a Wakandan instrument, one of their machines that hummed in precise harmonics, swept over the alloy. Where the stave touched the tune, the metal did a curious thing. It did not merely resonate, it unspooled a faint lattice of silvery sound that coalesced into shapes one could almost bear with the eyes closed. These shapes were not pictures, but they carried the weight of promises. A soldier who had watched from the doorway blinked as if a hand had pressed against his forehead, easing some long-held ache. The princess laughed, delighted by the sensation, and the sound bent the metal into a whispering that tasted of rain. Not all watchers were so quick to joy. Among the older company there were those who remembered the price that great craft had demanded in elder times. One of Elrond's counselors, a narrow-faced elf with voice like frosted glass, spoke in a caution that silenced curiosity's louder notes. He asked whether all metals answer enchantment thus, whether there were ores that would not sing in kindness but hungered instead for dominion. He touched the shield and felt the memory there turned like a coin in his fingers. Elrond met his gaze and let his own voice fall like a measured stone into deep water. All songs have consequences, he said, but not all consequences are ruin. The princess bent to modify a circuit. Sparks, very small and white, popped and went out like fireflies. She explained what she had learned in words that were at once childlike and precise. The alloy retained motion as a memory and allowed it to be altered. If coaxed correctly, it could be taught new responses. Elrond nodded his mind, which is given to long calculations, began to see a new craft. Not merely stronger arms for war, but instruments that could remember a way home or sing a barrier harmless as morning air. He thought of the gardeners of old, of how the elves had learned to weave shelter of tree and braid of root. Here was a companion art, he decided, not to supplant the old, but to walk with it. The test, however, was by no means quiet in its spreading. When the alloy sang, when the runes glinted and the lattice hummed, something beyond sight answered. In the first breathing after the demonstration, the wind paused. The very night air seemed to draw itself taut, as string does when plucked. A faint chill slid down the spines of those nearest the doors. Far beyond the halls where the elves kept their watch, in lands where shadow is practiced like a craft, a tightening was felt as if a gloved hand had closed upon a great thing. The phrase Elrond himself used when he could not yet name the thing hung for a moment speechless in the room. It was as if an unseen eye had noticed the sound and narrowed. No blade turned toward that notice in the hall, but ears pricked, and some old animal half asleep beneath the eaves opened its lids and stared toward the fall of the world. Scouts who had come to observe the experiment reported that along the road the birds had ceased their common chorus, and that, higher and farther away, a dark rider for a moment lifted his head and seemed to listen. Even the rivers heard it. The wards set in older days at the borders of these realms quivered like fences when a storm moves toward them, and one of those stones sent back a faint shiver in a language of light that only the eldest among the elves could truly read. "It will be felt," Elrond said, not angry, but stating what must be acknowledged. The prince's face shadowed for a breath. He understood war in his own land. He understood that the more a thing shines, the more it invites a certain sort of attention. "I would not have our art bring ruin," he replied. His voice carried what must be the weight of one who shoulders a kingdom's history. The princess, thinking in patterns and in the swift logic of inventions, countered with a different certainty. That to hide such a thing would be to leave the world poorer and the people of the world more easily broken. Elrond looked toward the shadowed mouths of the paths that led out from the stronghold. He considered the map that lay in his mind, the places where men squabbled, where dwarves tunneled, where the land was wide and thin. He weighed the quiet safety of secrecy against the daring of alliance. The shield on the bench seemed to breathe under its own remembered songs, as if longing to fulfill whatever it had been wrought to guard. The hall held a silence in which decisions were rounded like stones. "We shall learn more," Elrond said at last, and the words were an opening, not a closing. He set a hand upon the shield and felt its small warmth, the echo of the songs woven within it. "We will teach it restraint and teach ourselves to bind what is soundly bound." He named a small circle of elves and Wakandan minds to remain, to study and to test as the seasons turned. The princess inclined her head. She would stay. The prince, however, would take a handful of these first artifacts and journey outward to places where the taking of measure with others might be tested. At his words, there came from the doorway a quiet report. A scout with a face like wind-lifted leaf had seen, beyond the first rise, a blackness moving like spilled ink and a sudden, impossible stillness across the valley. He spoke of a thing that was not yet a chase, but might be one soon. Eyes across the room turned. The tightening at the world's edge had begun to make itself plain in small things. The prince's fingers tightened upon the hilt he wore not for bravado, but for the weight of decision. The princess touched the design upon her device and made small, swift adjustments that moved like a prayer. They had begun a new weaving then, craft and enchantment braided in a pattern neither wholly old nor wholly new. It was a beautiful and dangerous thing, and the beauty of it made the danger clearer rather than softer. Elrond, with the old patience of his kind, named the manner of their next step. A guarded road would open at dawn. A retinue would carry the first of their joint work to a lord in the south. The decision was not unwise, nor was it rash. Still, as the company moved to prepare, every face in that stone hall felt the pull of something watching, a tightening like a string drawn taut before the hand that plucks it. They would walk toward that pull, whether to draw it further or to teach it a different song. None in the hall knew yet which. The sky above the allied host had turned to a bruise, ancient and unblinking. Wind came out of the east in cold gusts that smelled of ash and of old metal. From that east the riders came, lives unmade and cloaked in a darkness that drank the light. They cut the air like thunder. The first shiver of their passage set shields ringing in a key no smith had taught, a note that made breath clutch beneath. Helms. Men who had not yet learned to fear such silence felt it now, and arrows trembled on strings. For a time, the strange metal held. The vibranium plates, laid like scales across the forelines, drank at the sound of their presence and fed back a low blue pulse. It was not warmth that the metal gave, nor any comfort. It was a hard, measured denial. A Nazgul's wail met the weave of the plates and found only a hollow. Horses reared to meet nothing. Men steadied. Elven bows strained and found their marks in the shadow's periphery where shadow had thought to be body. The black riders lost purchase, as if a skin had been pulled free of a bone. They circled instead of striking and rode on. That very advantage became its own peril. Where the vibranium shone, the wraiths withdrew. Where the wraiths could not pass, something older and hungrier moved like a scent toward what resisted. It was the way of every great darkness to gather toward light that would not yield. So when the Nazgul, thwarted at the front, turned instead to the flanks, they found what they had sought. Little seams, small betrayals of unity, where elvish pride met Gondorian caution and Wakandan invention met old law. Sauron's wine pushed there, and the Nazgul hammered at those seams with a fury that made the ground quake. The tactics were welded in hurried councils beneath banner and torch. Elfarkery and Gondor's iron, under Wakandan instruction, did not simply stand side by side. They became a single machine. Elves taught the sharpshooters to breathe with the wind and to send arrows that sang like silver. Wakandan engineers set vibranium cores into those shafts, so that each released an arc of force when it struck the shadow. Gondor answered with iron frames, ballistae whose arms were shod with blackened steel and whose buttresses bore Wakandan field plates. In the moments between charges, These inventions learned of one another. Arrows that would otherwise have cut only matter now carried shivers that repelled unbeing. Bolts of iron found purchase in windless air and cut a corridor of light through which soldiers could run. The clash was not of gore, but of echoes. A Nazgul struck the leftmost tower, and the tower groaned, throwing back a flare of blue sparks as vibranium columns flexed and rang. A longbow answered from an elven parapet, and the note of it was like a cry from a far hill. Men of Gondor raised shields that took the air and flung it back as if the shields themselves were blades. The sound of the battle braided, the metallic twang of a Wakandan coil, the hollow thunder of a northern horn, the brittle whisper of elven string. Each time one of these notes struck the shadows, they recoiled and jutted like a living wave met by a breaker of stone. Yet even as such strange harmonies held, costs were counted in lives and in laws. A smith of the woodland kind, one who had sworn in youth that no elven steel would be bent to the crafts of mortal kings, stood at the backbone of the new engine and wept as he tempered his oath into alloy. His hands guided elven filigree into the heart of a vibranium bolt. His lips moved, but no prayer left them. Those who watched saw a promise undone not in malice, but from necessity. The breaking made a sound smaller than the clang of steel, yet heavier than the weeping of any child, the audible surrender of a principle to a present need. On the rampart, where Wakandan and Gondorian guards stood shoulder to shoulder, a trusted captain fell. He had been the same man who had taught T'Challa to move his weight against a charge, who had kept the king's secrets and his mirth in equal measure. He fell without theatrics. The enemy's touch did not rend him, it took the thread of his will as if a needle had withdrawn. One moment his face was seen, all bone and sharp good humor the next. His head lolled, and the man slid from his horse as if a rope had been cut. Around him men went still, because the sight of death presented not ruin, but unbeing, an erasure that left the air colder and the music of the battle thinner. T'Challa caught the captain's hand falling from the rein and felt the pulse cease beneath his palm. His fingers closed reflexively, they closed on nothing. Grief did not have time to root. The battle demanded choices that scraped at the marrow. Horns sounded, and with that sounded a different sort of argument. Leaders found law measured in breath's words were too slow. Swords were too blunt. The council that had met in the sanctum now met at the crucible, the forging of a great bolt, a piece part elven craft and part Wakandan mind. It was not a cataclysm in the headlong age of war. It was a careful thing shaped by hands that knew both delight and dread. The shaft drank light. Runes, no longer wholly elvish, were etched along its length. The point was not pointed so much as hollowed, a small cup to hold a will. This must be fired, one voice said, short, sunlight cold. If we do not strike the heart, all else wanes. It was a captain of Gondor who spoke. He had his oath to the land, yet his eyes were raw with the sight of cities now at ruin. Opposite him, an elf clasped the bolt with fingers that did not tremble outwardly, but trembled inwardly like reed in wind. "We have not forged this to take life," the elf murmured. "We have forged it to break the chain." T'Challa stood apart, his chest measured, his cloak flicking gusts of night. He reached and placed both hands upon the shaft. The metal hummed into his skin, not warm and not cold, but as if it remembered 1,000 drums. The field around them arranged itself as if answering a single note. Wakandan engines cradled the bolt. Iron rails of Gondor unrolled beneath it, and elven men set taut cords across the firing yard. Soldiers moved in a choreography learned in the span of breaths. Nazgul drew near again, as if summoned by scent. They came faster this time, rides like knives, their faces a blank record of hunger. The vibranium guards lit and flared at their coming. The allied line braced as though for a last good word. Chala did not speak the words that might have been expected. He was king and prince and warrior, and his voice had held counsel in darker courts than this. Instead, he looked once to where the captain lay, and once toward the dark teeth of the east. He felt in that look the tilt of ages. There are burdens a ruler must carry not because they are asked, but because they must be borne. He stepped to the engine and took hold of the device that would send their answer toward Mordor. The firing was less a shout and more a made sound. It was a cord plucked between two great stones. When the engines released, there was a pressure that ran underfoot like a tide. The bolt leapt, not with the jag of a simple projectile, but with a living strange grace. It cleaved the air and left behind it a seam of blue flame and cold light. The sky seemed to open in the direction of the dark land and swallow that seam. Men caught their breath. Elves bowed their heads a little as if to a hymn. T'Challa stared, his jaw set. For an instant, the world hung balanced on the throw of this weapon. Mount Doom heard it, or perhaps what it heard was not sound measured by air, but a disturbance in something older than wind. Far to the east, beyond the black towers and the dead plains, the mountain answered with a sound like the unbending of iron and the sigh of an immense throat. The land trembled, faint at first, like the vibration at the back of a great instrument. Ash stirred like hair across the face of Mordor. From the mountain's crest came a faint red bloom, blossoming not of flower, but of heat, and the sky there pushed outward as if something beneath were turning in its sleep. In the watching dark, Chala felt a shift under his foot. Soldiers who had been wounds to courage now rose like obelisks. The allied banners leaned to the wind and did not fall. But something else rode, that answering rumble. It carried an intent older than the Nazgul and deeper than Sauron's breath. It was the sound of hunger waking from a distance, measured and patient. Those who listened in the quiet between heartbeats heard, faint and raw, a note that was not a word yet made a claim upon the world. Chala's mouth did not form regret. It formed a new plan beneath the bones of his face. He had chosen, and choices were like doors that closed behind a man. Beyond the door the path had already begun to lead. Around him, hands steadied the fallen captain and took up the wound of loss. Around him, elves gathered their strings, and the smiths turned their faces to their work once more. The mountain's answer moved from tremor to something that might be called a murmur, and with it came the tiny, inevitable kindness of fear, that it sharpens thought and compels motion. The blade of a Gondorian harquebus flashed as a warning. A sentry from Wakanda raised a hand and then lowered it, for there were more urgent tasks than threat in the air. Chala walked to the edge of the ridge and looked east until his sight failed. There, beyond the smoke, the dark teeth of Mordor had taken into themselves the bolts passing, and from their deepest hollow, the mountain rocked anew. It was not the end of what had been woken, nor yet the beginning of whatever answer would come. It was the first audible sign that the bolt had struck a tender and secret thing. He thought, for one small breath, of the vows broken, and of the captain whose life had emptied into the dust at his feet. He thought of the elf who had melded the old craft to new metal, and of the men who now stood ready in the wake of a choice that could not be unmade. Then he turned his face back to the host. Orders had to be given. Wounds had to be tended. The ground continued to tremble in a thin, persistent rhythm, as if Mount Doom now kept time for a new, darker measure. T'Challa lifted his chin and called aloud, not for rage, but for readiness. The sound of his voice, steady and sure, rode the wind. The allied armies answered. Beyond him, in the east, something moved within the mountain like a thing drawing breath for a long, cold sleep no longer needed. The watch ended, and the march began anew. Silence fell when the last argument died, but it was not the peace of agreement. It was a silence like a held breath, heavy with the iron-sweet scent of fear and the faint, cold perfume of distant fire. In the great hall, the lamps threw long tongues of light across carved stone, and where those fires could not reach the rings, influence shimmered and moved, as if the air itself were thinking. Faces that had been allies for years now sat at distance, watching one another for signs, for weakness, for resolve, for betrayal. The moral arithmetic had shifted beneath their feet. Measures once unthinkable were named and weighed as if they were coins to be spent. "You would break our law?" Okoye asked, voice hard as spear iron. She stood, the beads in her hair rattling like small bells. Her eyes were bright and furious as a hawk's. Across from her, a counselor in embroidered robes answered with steadier strings. "To keep a few more winters hidden will condemn many more. Secrecy is no shield against shadow that feeds on secrecy." The air tightened between them. Each syllable landed cold and precise. It was a quarrel about what Wakanda had always been at its heart, refuge or weapon. Shura's hands did not still. She did not choose sides with words, she chose them with metal. At her table, a lattice of vibranium lay like a sleeping spider, veins and filigree grown under her fingertips. The metal sang when she adjusted it, a low humming note that set dust motes shivering. She spoke to that sound as much as she did to the council. "If we strike openly," she said, "we expose what makes us hidden. If we go in blind, we bring the very temptation that will rend us." Her voice trembled not from fear, but from calculation. She dragged a tool through the lattice, a filament lit like a starlit. Vain, the ring stirring was not sudden. It was a small thing at first, a tightening at the throat, a shadow like a wing crossing a window. But even that smallness bent men's minds. Some among them felt only the clarity of war. Let the banners be cast off, they urged. Let Wakanda join the armies of the free in a war of front and fury. Send fleets and black-bladed hosts, and make of the shadow a problem of force rather than of cunning. Others, elders who had seen long seasons and known that power left untested could turn traitor, argued the opposite. Metal bound with desire could be made into a new ring in a new hand, they said, and the world would be finished not under the Dark Lord's heel, but under a different crown. T'Challa listened until listening became a kind of action. He moved through the chamber like a shadow whose outline was remembered more than seen. His decisions had weight. They fell through the room like stones into the deep. He thought of Wakanda's hidden way, the hush in the roads, the nets of silence that had let his people grow unseen at the edge of an older world. He thought of the old oath his father had sworn, of how it had saved them when men came like storms. He thought equally of the faces in fields beyond their borders, farmers, children, small folk, whose names he did not know and whose lives he had not been charged to protect until this day. The ring asked a question of him that had no right answer. To preserve what he had meant preserving, must he break his people's sanctities? He rose when he spoke. The room drew in a single breath. His voice was not loud, but it carried, even to the corners where the lamps dimmed. "I will go," he said, and the words landed like a bell. "I will take a company to Mount Doom." There was no flourish in the proclamation. There was only a man making a promise that would cut him from his home longer than any exile. Around him, counselors whispered and some cursed softly. For some, his choice was courage. For others, it was an abdication of duty. No one could call his decision reckless without seeing the measure of his plan. It was not merely a march into fire. It was instead a union of two arts that were not meant to meet: Shura's instruments and the ancestral songs that had, for generations, cradled Wakanda's power. "We will temper the metal with song," she said, voice flat and intent. "We will shape a resonance that hides us and steers us true. The device will be attuned to your voice, King. It will take your breath as part of its circuitry." She pushed a steel strap across the map table, and the thin band hummed under her palm like a throat clearing for a great note. They worked through night and near night. The resonator that came from Shura's hands looked almost ceremonial at first, a collar of woven metal and filigree inscribed not only with runes, but with syllables that had been sung for births and funerals and the turning of seasons. But when they laid the collar against the hollow of a crystal and struck a chord, the sound that rose was not human or machine alone. It was layered. Chala's tone braided into the vibranium's hunger. The singing made pathways in the metal. The metal in return steadied the song, held it from being scattered by wind. Sparks crawled like slow fire along the filigree. The air tasted of copper and old rain. Shura's eyes shone with something close to fear. "It is dangerous," she admitted. "We are placing our secret into a mechanism that may betray us if the ring finds its key." Okoye's lips pressed thin. She ran her hand over her spear shaft as if to steady her urge to strike. "And corruption?" she asked. "If this device makes one of us noble, how long before it makes one of us a tyrant?" The question hung between them, large and patient. That was the true terror. Not merely that the ring might whisper into a man's ear, but that some other desire born of power and the certainty of rightness might grow in its place. Chala's answer was not a speech, but a decision made with muscle and bone. He took the collar into his own hands and placed its inner edges against his throat. The metal settled cold against warm skin. He sang then, not loud, but a sound that came from very deep in his chest, something ancestral and private, worn thin by time, called up now as if from a grave. The note joined with the vibranium and made a third voice, the ancient syllable, the humming metal, and the man's claim to himself. The name of the song was no one's to say aloud. It lived in the bones. As the melody wound through the collar, the metal warmed as if in sun, and the hum of power steadied into something like a heartbeat. "Only a small company," he said, after the singing ended, breath fogging in the cold lamplight. "We will not bring our armies. We will not break the silence like a war horn. If we fail, the price will be the secret and many lives. If we succeed, the world will have been saved without knowing the cost." Some on the council met his gaze and saw not triumph, but a willingness to bear a weight that might crush him. Others saw recklessness and hated him for it, but none found words to force him from his course. Selection of the company was deliberate and brief. Okoye, by right of oath and by the ease of her steel, said she would come. Shuri, though she argued fiercely for distance, would not be left behind when her invention breathed. A tracker chosen for silence and cunning, a man whose name was spoken like a cut stone, quiet and necessary, was offered the role of guide. Each person who stepped forward did so with eyes that did not blink. There were no parades or farewells. The nation knew enough to hold its breath and say nothing more than a blessing under its breath. They trained as one moves toward a storm that cannot be turned. Their practice was not merely in arms. It was in the quieting of their steps, in the shading of their shapes, in the holding of breath like a second heartbeat. They learned to sing not as chorus, but as one. Throat! The song was not pretty. It was a tool, a lens, and a shield. When they sang, the instruments vibrated in sympathetic motion and windows rattled half a degree. The sound made the very timbers of the hall move as if they had ears. Once, during rehearsal, the hall shadows gathered as if listening. A single counselor who had sneered at the plan found himself weeping and could not say why. That is the small, sly thing the ring does. It opens the hidden places of men where shame and longing hide. On the eve of departure, Chala walked alone where the shrine to the ancestors rose, a circle of stones threaded with small white candles. The flame, moving out in the wind, made halos on the stone. He lifted his mask, his face bare to the night. The air smelled of bitter herbs and the sea far off. He placed his palm on the stone that bore his father's name and spoke no word that another could hear. He felt the collar at his throat, the metal warm like a living thing. The weight of leaving was a thing you could taste. The watchers at the shrine said a prayer without noise, and he understood that a line had been crossed whose echoes would never be mended. In the first light they left. The craft that would take them away looked like a ship, and like nothing of the ships men of the West had known. Built low and long, its belly was lined with resonant plates of vibranium. It moved with a silence so complete that even gulls flew around it as if puzzled. Shuri had placed the collar beside the helm as a kind of compass, its hum tuned to Chala's note, and it pulsed faintly like a heart under a blanket. The sea spray smelled of salt and oil. There was a sound like the beating of great wings as the vessel slid free of harbor. But to those who had not been taught of such things, it would have seemed only wind and wake. They steered east, not by the long ways of open road, but through paths known to few, ravines that ate sound, forests that could be crossed without leaving a footfall, and rivers whose surface became a mirror for a sky that had decided to hide them. The devices that guarded Wakanda's hollows whispered now and then a note of farewell, and birds that had been friends rose from trees as if to show the land what had been given away. Behind them, the hall's lamps were small points that shrank and then went out. Ahead of them lay a country whose maps were darker than their own history had prepared them for, and beyond that darkness, a mountain that breathed ash. As the shore fell away, the collar at Chala's throat thrummed in time with the engines. The song they had practiced rose from within the hull, a ripple beneath the hull, a sound that made the metal thin and strong at once. The resonator was a fragile promise. It might hide them, or it might be the key that opened their safekeeping to greedy eyes. He felt the ring as one feels a pressure against the chest far off and patient and knowing. The company around him sat, each in their private thought. The masks they wore more than literal. No one spoke. Only the song kept them company, a shared pulse that tugged at memory and resolve. They would sail until they could cross no more water. Then they would walk. The route to Mount Doom could not be marched by armies. It ran through bones of the world that were older than kings. They had chosen a small company because silence and nimbleness were their allies. They had chosen song because secrecy was not merely a hiding place, but a living thing that could be braided into steel. They had chosen danger because the other choices were worse. The vessel cut through dawn like a knife through silk. The horizon brightened and warmed while the mountain smoke lay like a future remembered at the edge of things. T'Challa stood at the prow with the collar pressing to his skin, his song coiled and ready. He knew the hour to come would test not only his strength, but his very sense of who he was. If the ring could rise and name desire within him, he must be ready to offer his voice and his will against it. The journey had begun, and with it a peril that would reach beyond any single life. They moved east, and the mountain's shadow reached to meet them. Beneath that ancient sky, a hush fell like thawing stone, and even the wind seemed to bow. Mount Doom breathed sulfur and old grief. Its slopes were a broken black sea, jagged and whispering with the footsteps of ages. Around its base, the company made their circle, Wakandan shields gleaming with a light not of this earth, elven cloaks moving like living shadow, and a small, fierce heart that walked on bare feet and hid courage like a coin. They set down their pride as carefully as any pack. Plans were spread on cooled rock hands, touched promises and fears with equal firmness. No song yet, only the slow, deliberate movement of people who knew what giving could cost. A tremor ran up the mountain and sent fine ash into the air like sifted grief. The Wakandan light answered, low and throbbing, a pulse through the metal that was more heartbeat than alloy. It hummed against the palms of the warriors who bore it, and those palms learned the instrument's new language at once. Vibration as counsel, cadence as command. The elven singer began then, a thin voice threading old languages through the raw air. Her hymns wound around Wakandan radiance, braiding old song with new sound until both were changed. The notes struck against metal and marrow alike. Some of the chanting sank into the vibranium and did not come out again unchanged. Plans are brittle until forged in fire. Here, at the foot of doom, they spoke plainly of what was needed. They would not carry the ring in triumph, nor would they attempt to take it by force. Instead, they devised a shape of cunning and cost. A device wrought from vibranium would stanch the ring's subtlety, not by stealing its will, but by reflecting it until it could not find a foothold. The elves offered lines of light to steady the path the Wakandans lent, their metal and their most guarded knowledge. The small one, the one whose eyes still held Hobbit Earth stubbornness, sat unmoving, listening, fingers tight around the tattered cloak that had become his armor. He said little, but when he spoke, the company sharpened, for his voice had the authority of someone who had carried more than any council could ask. They climbed when the moon took leave of the sky, moving on hands and knees where stepping would have broken them. Heat rose like a living thing, and sulfur knifed the throat. The path narrowed, and each step required the company to trade weight for steadiness. A narrow band of light from Wakandan shields lit the way elven feet bore them with a silence older than law. There were moments when the device, half in gene, half prayer, sounded with a resonance that made the hollow of the mountain feel like a drum. It sang back at the ring as if to say, "I shall not be ruled." Yet even as vibranium answered, it took on the ring's cadence like a wound remembers a hand. The metal learned the timing of a darker music. It kept the company alive and also began to change in ways they had not fully measured. They came at last to the rim where the sky opened and fire lived in the earth. The smell was of old metal and decisions. Heat licked armor, and skin sweat mingled with ash and the salt of tears. There, upon that raw lip, they set the device and the ring together. The small one raised the ring as one might lift a small bright stone that contains an ocean. Around him stood friends who would not look away. The Wakandan king, calm as riverbed, placed his hand on the machine. His touch was an oath and a caution both. Vibranium was not a cure without cost. The elven singer composed one last hymn, and the notes braided with the metal's hum. Until the two were indistinguishable, it was impossible now to tell whether music prompted metal or metal taught music. Then came the first betrayal of expectation. The ring did not howl, it whispered. It drew at hearts with the tendrils sweet promises of victory, of kingdoms bound to one firm hand. It tried, as it had always tried, to make the thing offering destruction feel like salvation. The small one shuddered. For a moment, pride flared in him like a candle, and the idea of wielding the ring to end all ills brushed his mind like warm air. The elven voice faltered, and in that faltering the company saw how close the very best could fall. Quick as thought, the Wakandan king moved, not with brute force, but with an act of stewardship. He laid his own ceremonial necklace upon the device and let his authority be known. The metal took his cadence and waited. The ring saw another will and recoiled. It recoiled but did not relent. The device began to sing louder, and the mountain answered with a rumble as old stones shifted. The vibranium took strains of the ring's voice and fed them back, turning them into an ugly echo that could not control nor charm. The effect was deliberate cruelty, to reflect temptation back upon itself until it eroded. Such reflection demanded a sacrifice, a parting of what made each hand strong. The Wakandan metal shivered and shed a thin flake of light that fell away like a small comet. The king's chest tightened. He had known some measure of pain would be asked of him. An ally on the rim, a veteran ranged with arrows notched in ages of war, fell silent, palm over throat, his breath leaving him with the small dignity of one who has given what was most dear. The company could not afford to grieve long. They carved a path through sorrow and kept to the task. At the point of final unmaking, desperation sharpened everything. The sound in the metal thickened, like a throat closing. The elven song became a blade, slicing the ring's voice into phrases it could not complete. The small one felt the ring's weight as a pressure on his mind, but also a clarity. Some true things must be broken, not possessed. He stepped forward, and with hands that trembled but did not fail, he let the ring touch the vibrating plate. For a breath the world held, and then the device took the thing whole. Its hum rose into a high keening, bright as splintered glass. Light poured outward, not the aura of command the ring usually made, but a scattered, frantic flare of possible dominions torn apart. The mountain answered, higher and louder, and then the darkness inside the ring began to come undone, It was not clean. The ring lashed out as it diminished, and several were struck by the recoil of its unbinding. None bled in the exaggerated fashion of myth, but the harm was of a more insidious measure. The vibranium that had swallowed the ring began to change its rhythm. Where once it sang a steady, protective cadence, it now kept a new, ragged tempo. The metal's resonance had accepted stains of the ring's will, and in so doing rewrote a part of its making. Wakandan hands felt the difference immediately. Shields that had absorbed blows now rang with a hollow edge, and the warmth the metal gave had a sharper pitch. The king's face was quiet as a man who had seen and accepted a frightening transformation in his house. When the ring at last was undone, it did not vanish with a trumpet. It crumbled like dried fruit, a bitter black dust that the wind took in ill temper. The mountain shuddered once, an exhale of ash, and the company fell to their knees more from exhaustion than from triumph. They had done what songs prophesied as impossible, yet their victory bore the stamp of cost. Friends who had gone into the climb would not return whole. Names would be spoken thereafter with small, serious smiles, because the dead and the altered insisted upon remembrance. The Wakandan veil, the magic that had once hidden a nation like a curtain of mist, thinned in the wake of the metal's change. It had been tied to a harmony that the vibranium could no longer sing. In the same key, visibility crept back into the world like dawn. Morning came quietly, like the settling of dust. The elven singer closed her eyes and let her voice shape small elegies. The small one wrapped his hands in the cloak he carried and felt the weight of loss as a companion rather than a creditor. The Wakandan king stood with his shoulders set, a ruler who had given not only counsel, but part of his people's shield. He touched the changed vibranium with a reverence that was almost fear. They had saved a world, but the tool they had trusted bore a new seam. It hummed now with dual memory of Wakanda's care and of a darker influence that might never be fully cleansed. That truth settled on them like a mantle. Discussion followed without flourish. To hide was no longer possible. The world had seen Wakandan light braided with elf song in a manner plain enough to stir curiosity and alarm. What was wisdom now? Secrecy or openness? The king's answer was a quiet, powerful thing. Stewardship requires honesty. They would not return to the old concealment and cleverer isolation. Wakanda would lift its veil in deliberate steps and share the burden of repair. The altered vibranium would be studied, its new cadence learned, and its dangers named plainly so others might guard against them. Allies would be invited to remit knowledge and aid. A new council would form, neither secret nor simple. It was an admission and a promise, tightly braided. As dawn stained the edge of the ash plain, the company gathered their few remains and their more fragile hopes. They carried the changed metal with hands that trembled from heat and from the memory of what the ring had demanded. The small one looked to the king and then to the elven singer. There was a question in his gaze not yet voiced. The king answered only by a small nod, and in that nod the future was acknowledged and deferred to work. They would walk back from the mountain with victories and with wounds, and each step would shape the way their peoples remembered what had been done here. The mountain behind them exhaled again, and ash drifted like prayer across the path. They began the descent. Each footfall was a promise in motion to learn, to mourn well, to teach the world the hard lesson they had all paid for. The journey downward would take them into council that had never yet existed, a shared keeping of strength and the labor of repairing what power had bent. Ahead lay stations of decision and of repair. Behind lay the blackened edge of a world almost lost. They moved not toward a simple peace, but toward the long, careful work of bearing what they had saved without letting it rule them.